Daniel Carter hadn't set foot in Eldwood for 12 years. Not since the war stole his youth and left him with scars no one could see. Now, with Lily's small hand clutching his, he faced the crumbling house the town called the Widow's Folly. A derelict pile they said was cursed. But as he kicked open the warped door, a glint of something metallic flickered in the shadows, whispering secrets that could either save them or bury them both. They came in on the soft edge of evening, when porch lights blinked to life like small stars, and the lawn had the look of something iron smooth. Music drifted, nothing loud, a polite kind of joy. Voices stretched across the grass, stitched together by laughter and clinks of glass. Daniel Carter paused at the iron gate with the old duffel on his shoulder, the canvas worn thin where it rubbed his collarbone. He stood there a breath too long, as if the gate would ask for a password from a life he didn't carry anymore. Lily shifted beside him. 10 years old, hair braided neat. She held a folded card she'd drawn herself. A small house, 2 figures, a dog that looked more like a cloud with legs. She had promised herself to hand it to her grandmother if asked, though no one had said they were invited inside. Not exactly. Daniel adjusted the strap, exhaled, and pressed the latch. The gate answered with a tired groan that made 2 heads near the drinks table glance up, then away, quick as flies. The grass underfoot was springy. White chairs fanned in a careful crescent under an ash tree. Paper lanterns hung from its arms, moving a little in the light breeze, heartbeats slow, back and forth. The tablecloths were pressed and bright. The silver had been polished to erase fingerprints. Somewhere a caterer in black shoes crossed the patio without sound. In that tidy world, Daniel felt like a boot print in new snow. He did not wear his uniform. He hadn't worn it for months. He had settled on a pale blue shirt, sleeves buttoned, khaki pants that still held a crease from when he'd left the store. The shirt didn't quite fit across his shoulders. Combat had built him in odd places. Grief had hollowed him in others. Sun and wind had written their notes on his skin. None of that mattered to him on the driveway, and all of it mattered once he stepped onto the grass. No one greeted them. That was the first thing. The second was the way conversation slackened without actually stopping, like a river forced to slide around a rock. The third was Lily's fingers, small and sure, finding the loose skin at his wrist the way a child finds the seam in a favorite blanket. He looked down long enough to smile, which was really just a softening at the corner of his mouth. It was practice. He had been practicing the kind of smile that didn't ask anything from anyone. In another life, he might have called name. He knew almost all of them once, names soldered to faces. Faces welded to stories. Time had broken the welds. Now there were only outlines. A man with a golf tan, a woman in a coral dress, a cousin whose laugh used to fill a room. They glanced and then repaired to their glasses, their phones, the safe province of weather. A server with a silver tray approached, dipped the tray toward Lily, and then, seeing Daniel's duffel, reconsidered with a gentle pivot. Lily pretended not to notice. She smoothed the front of her dress, lined up the edges of the card in her hands. He could feel her trying to be smaller. He knelt to her height and checked the strap on her shoe, a habit from the early days when she tripped over everything because she was too busy watching birds. "You okay?" he asked, but not out loud. With Lily, he had learned the vocabulary of weight and pressure. A squeeze meant yes. A tug meant no. 2 taps meant later. He felt the quick squeeze. She was okay enough. The music pushed along. Somewhere inside the house, ice tumbled into a bucket. The porch door opened and closed, opened and closed. Through the windows, he could see the family photographs arranged in grids. Vacations and graduations, smiles with no shadows. His own image didn't live in those squares. It hadn't for some time. The thought tried to climb into his throat. He swallowed. The past came up anyway, the way old smoke lives in a coat you haven't worn for years. He found his breath and counted it back to even. He took 2 steps forward, then 1. The white carpet rolled over the lawn toward a long table fat with flowers. He stopped at the edge of it, not touching the border, only looking as if the carpet were a line drawn in chalk. Lily tilted her head to study the petals, pale roses delicate as ears held. She wanted to say the color out loud. She didn't. She pressed the card to her chest like a shield. Daniel had told himself he could do this. Show up, stand quiet, hand his daughter to the hour, then take her when the hour ended. He had told himself the war was over. He had said it so often he almost believed it. But war had a way of smelling like cut grass and lemon polish. War was sometimes the arithmetic of who sits where, and who looks away. He lowered the duffel to the ground. The bag slumped against his leg, as if relieved. Inside, a spare sweater for Lily, her medication in a small bottle, a paperback he never finished, a folding hairbrush missing 2 teeth. He had learned to travel light, and not just with luggage. A voice rose and fell near the cake. Bright as tin. Another voice answered. Someone laughed and covered their mouth. A 4-chime glass once, then twice. He told himself they were laughing about something else. He told himself everything he needed to keep his face arranged. Lily lifted one shoe and examined the grass stain on the edge. She rubbed at it with her thumb, then gave up and let it be. He loved that about her. The quiet treaties she made, again and again, with things she couldn't fix. The sun slid lower in the trees. A moth tapped a lantern and circled back. He could smell the grill. Faintly, meat and smoke braided with rosemary. Hunger came and left like a tide. He had learned, in the harder months, to let a need arrive without rushing to meet it. That was one kind of acceptance, staying still and letting what hurt move through. At the patio doors, movement, the kind of shift a room makes when the person at the center enters it. Daniel felt it in his shoulders before he saw it with his eyes. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He let the moment come to him, and when it did, he looked down at Lily first. Her braid had loosened at the nape. A small curl had escaped and lay there like punctuation. He smoothed it to the side, a father's gentle edit. He remembered a time when he measured his days in miles and markers. 22 clicks to a checkpoint, 7 minutes to first light. 1 breath to steady the shot. Now he measured them in the length of a child's hand, in the time it took to lace a shoe, in the distance from a gate to a table he wasn't sure he belonged at. It was a different math. It felt heavier and kinder at once. He felt the past climb onto him again. The months he hadn't slept well, the posted pictures he didn't appear in, the dinner table with an empty place set just in case. He let it have its weight. He did not argue with it. That was new. He had learned the hard way that fighting a ghost only teaches it your weak spots. Better to nod at it, say, "I see you," and then square your shoulders under it until it becomes ordinary. A breeze lifted the edge of the white carpet and let it fall back into place. Lily's card fluttered, and she steadied it. Daniel straightened and picked up the duffel once more. It didn't feel lighter. It felt honest. He stood taller, not to make himself bigger, but to make room for what the night required. Patience, a steady pulse, the clean refusal to bruise. He looked across the lawn without searching for anyone to save him. He had stopped looking for that. He looked only for the path he and his girl would take when the hour ended. The way out that wouldn't start a fire. Acceptance wasn't surrender. He had decided. It was what you did with your hands when there was no weapon to hold and still a life to carry. So he rested one hand at the small of Lily's back, felt her lean into it, and together they waited in the warm, careful light. 2 quiet figures at the edge of a party that had forgotten how to say their names. The pause was short, but it stretched in Daniel's mind like a road under heat shimmer. Heads had turned just enough to confirm what they were seeing. Him, the soldier who had left and somehow returned without the armor people expected, and then turned back, as if politeness demanded they resume their sentences exactly where they'd left off. The air felt heavier now, even with the evening breeze brushing across the lawn. It began at the edge of the drinks table, where a cousin of Marianne's, Daniel thought his name might be Paul, leaned into a woman in a coral shawl and murmured something that brought the smallest curve to her lips. The kind of smile that didn't rise high enough to the eyes. Daniel didn't hear the words, but he felt them. A second later, another man, mid-40s golf tan, watched gleaming under the lantern light. Let his gaze skim the length of Daniel's shirt and pants before landing on the duffel bag. He tilted his chin toward someone else and said, just loud enough for the next ring of guests to catch it. Guess he's moving into that wreck old Samuel left behind. Even the rats packed up and left. The words traveled the short distance between them without rush, almost leisurely, as if sure they'd find their mark. Daniel didn't flinch, not outwardly. His eyes dropped to the grass for a moment, noting the scatter of petals from the centerpieces, the pressed pattern of shoe soles in the turf. He learned a long time ago that letting insult take root was a choice. And tonight, he wasn't making it. Lily heard it. He knew she did by the way her fingers tightened around his wrist, the little tug she gave. Half wanted to leave. Half wanted to stay because leaving would mean they'd won something. She kept her chin down, staring at her shoes as though the straps had suddenly become fascinating. He knelt beside her, adjusting the buckle on the right one. It didn't need adjusting. The act was as much for him as for her, a small shield they could crouch behind together. The buckle clicked softly, a sound only they shared. He could smell the faint soap from her morning bath, the kind that clung to her hair long after it dried. "You're fine," he thought, not speaking, just willing it across the small space between their faces. She gave the barest nod, her eyes fixed on the grass, and then her thumb traced a small circle on the back of his hand. That was her way of saying, "I'm holding on." The coral-shawled woman's laugh trilled again, too quick and too high to be natural. Daniel rose slowly, letting the weight of the duffel settle against his side. The bag felt heavier now, though nothing inside had changed. It wasn't the fabric or the contents. It was the way a room could place stones in a man's pockets without ever touching him. From the patio, the clink of silverware meeting china rang clear and delicate. Somewhere, a cork eased out of a bottle with a sigh. He took in the scent of grilled fish, lemon butter melting into charred skin. The crisp note of white wine uncorked too early. The world here was curated, every detail arranged so nothing unexpected might intrude. He, by standing here, was the intrusion. Another comment floated past, this one from farther off, tossed casually into a group conversation. Guest courts letting him play father for a while. A ripple of low chuckles followed. The kind people used when they didn't have to own their amusement. Daniel kept his breathing even. Anger had a way of showing itself in the chest first, tightening until it showed in the jaw. He wouldn't give them that. Instead, he shifted the duffel from one shoulder to the other, the straps scraping the back of his neck. The sound was quiet, but in the moment, it felt like an anchor being dragged. He glanced toward the porch where light spilled in a perfect rectangle onto the lawn. Through the open door, he could see the polished floorboards, the tidy rows of chairs, the gleam of glassware. None of it had room for dust, or for people like him who carried it with them. Lily had turned her head toward the lanterns now, following the slow dance of moths against their thin paper skins. Her grip on his wrist had eased, but she was still close enough that her elbow brushed his each time she shifted. He found himself matching her slow breaths without meaning to. They had learned this together over the years, when the air was thick with what you couldn't fix. You borrowed each other's rhythm until it passed. The man in the golf tan said something else, softer this time, but his eyes flicked deliberately to Daniel's. It was an invitation, a dare, really, to close the distance and answer. Daniel let the moment hang, then dropped his gaze to the grass again, as if he hadn't heard a thing. Silence, he discovered, could be heavier than words if you let it sit long enough. A gust moved through the yard, rattling the lanterns against their wires, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and the faint salt of someone's perfume. Daniel looked past the rows of chairs to where the yard ended in shadow, and beyond that, the narrow strip of street he'd taken to get here. The street would still be there when they left. It was a small comfort, but he held on to it. He felt Lily's hand slip into his again. She didn't look up at him, didn't need to. He closed his fingers gently around hers, the way you might hold something fragile that still had its own heartbeat. Around them, the hum of the party resumed its full volume, folding over the sharp edges of the last few minutes. It was almost as if they'd never walked in, almost as if they were still outside the gate. But the words had landed, not as wounds. He had built too much armor for that, but as reminders that the past, no matter how far you drove from it, had a way of showing up in well-lit gardens, wearing pressed shirts, carrying drinks, that some doors would always open to let in. He straightened again, not to tower, but to balance himself against the weight. The duffel sat steady at his side. Lily's hand stayed in his, and though the voices around them braided into something warm for everyone else, for him it was still the low thrum of a place that had not forgotten who he had been, and perhaps never would. Accepting that was the only way forward, and tonight he could almost manage it. They left before the cake was cut, though Daniel doubted anyone would have asked them to stay. He didn't hurry them out. He simply found a moment when eyes were turned elsewhere, nodded once to the air as if someone had given permission, and began the slow walk back toward the gate. Lily matched his steps without being told, her small shoes pressing into the white carpet that led across the grass. The music followed them for a few paces, but it thinned with every step, like a radio station drifting out of range. The gate gave its familiar groan when he pushed it open. It was a sound he had learned to read, metal on metal, a fatigue born from years of holding the same shape. He thought of himself in that way sometimes. The hinges still turned, but every movement carried the memory of strain. He let it close behind them without looking back. The latch caught with a click. Final but not cruel. The street outside was a softer place. Porch lights glowed against the deepening blue, moths circling in their little orbits. Somewhere a sprinkler ticked across a lawn. The air smelled of rain that had not yet come. Daniel let his shoulders ease down a fraction, enough to feel the stretch in the fabric of his shirt. Lily still held his hand, her grip neither tight nor loose now, just there. It was a steady thing in the cooling evening. They reached the truck, the old Ford that had been his since before she could walk. The paint had dulled to a shade that didn't have a name anymore, somewhere between gray and blue. He opened the passenger door, waited for her to climb in, and set the duffel on the seat between them. The engine turned over on the second try, the familiar cough settling into a low hum. He checked the mirrors, not for traffic but for habit, then pulled away from the curb. The road unspooled under the headlights. Houses gave way to stretches of open land, fences sagging here and there, mailboxes leaning into the weight of years. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his thigh, fingers tapping a rhythm that belonged to no song. He didn't fill the space with words. Lily had learned not to expect them on drives like this. The quiet wasn't absence, it was room. They passed the diner where he used to meet other vets for coffee, the lights inside yellow and forgiving. A man in a ball cap sat alone at the counter, reading a newspaper that no longer made front pages about the war. Daniel glanced once, then back to the road. The past had a way of appearing in the corners like that, familiar shapes he didn't stop for anymore. The landscape flattened into fields, the last of the sun bleeding into the horizon. Telephone poles marked the miles, their wires humming faintly. Lily pressed her forehead to the glass, watching as the world slid by in pieces. A rusted tractor, a dog trotting along a ditch. A mailbox painted to look like a fish. She didn't ask where they were going. She knew by the direction of the turns. He could feel her looking out, could almost see the reflection of her eyes in the glass. It reminded him of the convoys overseas, hours spent staring out of reinforced windows, counting landmarks, trusting the driver to know the way. There had been comfort in that trust then, as there was now. The truck's cabin smelled faintly of old leather, and the pine-scented air freshener clipped to the vent. The radio stayed off. Instead, the sound was the engine's steady thrum, the occasional rattle from the glove compartment when they hit a rough patch of road. Daniel found his mind drifting to the night's voices, the way they had shaped the air around him. They hadn't followed him here, but their weight rode in the bed of the truck like invisible cargo. Lily shifted in her seat, tucking her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. Her braid had loosened again, a thin strand curling against her cheek. He wanted to reach over, smooth it back, but the wheel needed both hands for the turn ahead. The gravel popped under the tires as they left the main road. The headlights caught the dust rising in their wake. Out here, the sky opened wider. Stars began to press through the fading light. Daniel slowed the truck, not because the road demanded it, but because the moment did. The gate to the property appeared at the edge of the beams, its ironwork tangled with weeds. He stopped just short of it, letting the engine idle. For a long moment, he didn't move. His hand stayed on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the shape of the house just visible beyond the gate. The silhouette was unmistakable. 3 stories, roofline uneven, one corner of the porch sagging as if it had taken a deep breath and never let it out. Even from here, the place seemed to exhale the scent of damp wood and earth. Lily leaned forward, peering through the mesh of rusted metal. "We're here," she said, her voice almost a whisper. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded once, more to himself than to her. The past was waiting on the other side, patient and unhurried. Tonight, he would open the gate and drive in. Not because he had stopped running from it, but because there was no other road left. The engine ticked softly as Daniel cut it off, the heat from the long drive rising through the hood and curling into the cool night air. For a while, neither he nor Lily moved. The gate loomed in front of them, tall enough to hide most of what lay beyond, its bars clothed in a mesh of vines and brambles that had claimed the metal like a slow, patient tide. In the beam of the truck's headlights, flakes of rust glimmered faintly, an old kind of glitter born of neglect. Daniel leaned forward, resting both hands on the steering wheel, eyes tracing the familiar outline of the property beyond. It had been years since he'd seen it. and then only in the few faded photographs Samuel had mailed before disappearing from the world's busy circles. Those photographs had always been framed carefully, corners of a library, the edge of a porch, the outline of a window against heavy curtains. They'd never told the whole truth. Now, faced with the house itself, Daniel saw why. The roofline slouched against the sky. Shingles warped like old bark. The third-floor balcony sagged on one side, its rail split and leaning as if someone had once stepped out for air and the house had taken offense. One shutter hung crooked, tapping lightly against the siding in the faint wind. There was no light inside, no warm glow to say come in. Just the dense dark of a place left to its own slow decay. Lily pressed her palms to the glass, breath fogging a small circle she could peer through. Her voice, when it came, was small and hesitant. It's big. She didn't say beautiful. She didn't say scary. Daniel appreciated her restraint. Big was enough. He reached for the keys in the ignition, twisting them slowly until the headlights winked out. Darkness swelled immediately. The kind that reshapes a place, makes edges uncertain. The only sound was the low hiss of the cooling engine and the whisper of leaves shifting against one another. He stepped out into the gravel. The crunch beneath his boots, startling in the quiet. The air smelled of damp earth and something older, moss, perhaps, and the dry sweetness of wood that had long ago stopped fighting the weather. He walked to the gate, tested the latch. It resisted, stiff from years of disuse. He put his shoulder to it, felt the vines stretch reluctantly, a few snapping in sharp little sighs. The gate swung inward with a slow, aching groan, like the first breath of someone who'd been holding it too long. Lily opened her door and climbed down, her shoes landing softly on the gravel. She held her arms close, not from cold, but from the weight of the moment. The path ahead was choked with weeds that rose past her knees. Daniel reached out a hand, after only a second's pause. She took it. They stepped through together. The ground inside the gate felt different, softer, as if the soil had been resting too. Each step released the faint scent of crushed grass and hidden dampness. The driveway, once gravel, had mostly surrendered to a patchwork of weeds and bare earth. In the distance, the porch stretched across the front of the house, its boards bowed, the rail casting thin shadows in the moonlight. Daniel's gaze lifted to the second floor. A single window was cracked open at the bottom, though no light or movement came from within. For a moment, he imagined Samuel standing there in some other year, a cup of coffee in his hand, the steam caught in the morning sun. The image faded as quickly as it came. They reached the porch steps. Daniel tested the first with the tip of his boot. It gave slightly but held. He led Lily up, each board answering with its own creak, a chorus of small protests. At the top, he paused, the front door just ahead. Its paint had long since blistered away, leaving the raw grain exposed. Weather-silvered and split in places. The knob was brass, tarnished green, and when he tried it, it turned without resistance. The door swung open into a darkness that smelled of dust, old paper, and was left to the mercy of rain. The air was cool and still, the kind of stillness that feels like it's listening. Daniel didn't step inside yet. He stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust, letting the weight of the years settle where it would. Lily hovered just behind him, peering around his arm. "Has anyone lived here?" she asked, the question almost more breath than sound. He didn't answer right away. The truth was complicated, in the ways that mattered. Voices in the rooms, footsteps up the stairs. No, but the house had lived its own life, in weather and silence, in the quiet keeping of whatever Samuel had left behind. Daniel turned to her, his face softening in the dim light. "It's ours now," he said simply, not as a promise, but as a fact. The first of many they'd have to accept. She nodded, looking past him into the dark. There was fear there, yes, but also the kind of curiosity that doesn't ask permission. He stepped over the threshold first, the floor groaning under his weight. Lily followed, her smaller steps making less sound. Behind them, the door drifted back on its hinges until it met the frame with a muted thud. The sound echoed faintly through the empty rooms, then faded, leaving only the quiet and the long work of making a place like this into something you could call home. The first breath inside was thick enough to taste, dust and paper and a low, sour note of wood that had taken on rain and kept it. Daniel stood just past the threshold, letting the dark shape of the foyer rise around him. It was a narrow space with a staircase climbing to the right, its banister rubbed to a dull shine where hands had polished it over years that did not include his. The floorboards gave a cautious creak under his boots, the kind of sound that asks who you are and how long you intend to stay. He set the duffel down against the wall. The bag slumped as if relieved. He stood a moment longer, hands at his sides, not touching anything. Not yet. Scattered near the baseboard. A bent nail, a dull penny, a button from a coat that might have hung on the pegs by the door once, when the house still knew the weight of ordinary weather. On the far wall, a mirror had fogged with dust. Whatever it reflected looked like memory. Hazy, a little warped, gentler than truth. Lily waited at his shoulder, smaller voice inside a smaller body, her breathing quick and audible in the hush. He could feel her watching his hands, the way children do. If your hands stay steady, then the world is holding. He touched the newel post, as if greeting someone, then trailed his fingers along the banister. A notch halfway up, as if a suitcase had once slammed there. A ladder of faint gouges lower down. The kind left by a dog that wanted to see around a corner. The house had its own old language, and Daniel had always been good with other people's letters. On the left, a doorway opened into what had been a parlor. Shapes under sheets rested like sleeping animals. When he stepped in, dust lifted from the fabric in slow spirals. The window shades were lowered. Pale light leaked around their edges and laid out stripes on the rug. He crossed the room and raised one shade 2 inches. It was enough. Light brushed across a low table where a cup still sat, a ring of brown dried at its bottom. The arc of a handle chipped and repaired with some long-ago glue. He listened. Houses talk when they are left alone, with answering weather, a pipe settling its old arguments, the small, dry rustle of something living a harmless life between walls. Nothing rushed at them. Nothing warned them away. He let his shoulders fall the inch they had been held. Lily moved past him on soft soles, her fingers landing on the edge of a covered chair and leaving 4 small tracks through the dust. She drew a 5th, then a 6th, a quiet tally of being here. He found a switch and tried it. Nothing. He tried another. Still nothing. He left them down and did not swear. In the kitchen, maybe a fuse box, maybe a miracle. He would look later. For now, he unzipped the duffel, took out the small flashlight he kept wrapped in a pair of socks, and thumbed it on. Its beam cut a clean path across the dim. He aimed it toward the mantel, a clock there, brass and glass. Its hand stopped at 12 and 20. A framed photograph face down beside it. He lifted it, turned it over. A man with Carter bones stood on the very porch they had just climbed. Coat buttoned tight, eyes direct, not cruel. Samuel, younger than Daniel had ever seen him. Behind the glass, a thread of web had found the corner and held it. Daniel set the frame back where it had been and did not wipe it clean. Not yet. The kitchen was a surprise only in that it wasn't one. Cabinets with glass fronts, panes filmed over. A sink stained with iron. A small calendar still on a month that had come and gone years before. He turned the faucet. A cough, a shudder, then a ribbon of water the color of tea. He let it run until it cleared as something you could call clean without lying. He cupped a little in his palm, tasted it. Cold, metallic at first, then only cold. He filled a cracked pitcher halfway and set on the counter. A narrow drawer, sticky but obedient, held the kinds of things all kitchens keep. Rubber bands and a ball. Pencils with their erasers chewed off. A handful of screws that fit nothing in sight. Under the sink, a broom with a soft, splayed head. A dustpan warped at the mouth. A stack of grocery bags folded into triangles. He shook the broom once, stepped back as dust lit the air, and then began to pull the day's small ground into a neat line. It made no visible difference, and every difference. Lily's eyes followed the broom as if it were a hand smoothing hair. He handed her the dustpan. She knelt, tucked the pan's lip flat against the scratched plank, and gathered the line, tapping it into a paper bag with the seriousness children lend to first tasks. They worked through the kitchen and into the hall, not hurrying, not stopping for every cobweb, letting the lit path widen little by little. The sound of bristles on would set a rhythm, a kind of prayer you say with your body. When they came back to the parlor, Daniel wiped the edge of the low table with the sleeve of his shirt, then thought better of it and used a folded rag he'd found, stiff with age. He uncovered one chair, then another, laying the sheets across the arms as if undressing a guest who had fallen asleep in their clothes. The upholstery beneath was faded but intact. Lily pressed the seat with her palm and watched the fabric rise back slow. She smiled with just the left corner of her mouth, the side that told him she was leaving room for sadness, but not feeding it. He found a tin in a drawer by the hearth and opened it to brittle stubs of candles. He chose one that still held its wick straight, stood on a saucer, and touched a match to it. Flame arrived with a tiny sound, a soft wish you could almost hear. He set the saucer at the edge of the mantel. The room changed, not in shape, not in size, but in a way that had to do with belonging. Light had a way of saying you may sit. They did. He lowered himself into a chair that breathed out dust and then settled under him. Lily climbed into the one next to it, feet not yet reaching the floor, heels making small moons on the fabric. For a while they listened to the house tell its evening story, the last drops finding a pipe elbow, the tick of the cooling stove, the hush that grows when you have stopped moving and a place starts to make room. From the duffel, he took out a clean t-shirt and rolled it for a pillow. He did not spread a blanket yet. He wanted the house to see them upright for a while longer. He looked at Lily's hands, one resting on her knee, the other playing with the hem of her dress, worrying a loose thread he would later tuck away. As if feeling his glance, she set both hands flat on her thighs and let them be still. He walked to the foot of the stairs and looked up. Darkness gathered on the landing like a folded coat. The steps were bare wood, risers nicked and scuffed in the middle where 1,000 feet had chosen the same line. Back in the parlor, he eased the shade a little higher. Evening had deepened to night. Beyond the window, their truck made a dull shape against the gravel, a faithful animal waiting. In the candlelight, dust turned to slow snow, then settled again. He felt the day's weight arrange itself in him. Voices at a party that hadn't needed them. The long road out, the gate that had sighed. This room with its timid flame. None of it could be changed by wanting. The wanting was what wore him out. He set it down like the duffel, close enough to reach if he needed it, far enough to rest. He touched Lily's shoulder, a brief, grounding press, then let his hand fall. "We'll make a spot," he said, finally saying something because the house felt ready to hear it. He moved the two chairs closer together, slid the low table aside, and with the broom made a square on the floor. 4 strokes, corners neat. Not a boundary. A prayer. She nodded, solemn as ceremony. He unrolled the thin blanket, placed the t-shirt at one edge, and set the pitcher within reach. The clock on the mantel did not restart, but time found a way to move anyway. He sat with his back to the wall. Lily laid down on her side and watched the candle turn itself to a shorter version of what had been. Her eyes blinked slower. When her breath evened, he let his own match it. Acceptance wasn't a word he would have chosen once. It had always sounded like giving up. But here, with the broom leaning in a corner, the first square of floor claimed, the dark holding steady, he felt something loosen that didn't mean surrender. It meant a truce with the house, with the day, with the past that insisted on coming along. He let it in. He let it sit. And the room, after a while, seemed to breathe with him. Night gathered itself into the corners and stayed there. The candle had burned a shallow bowl into its own body, the wick leaning as if tired of holding up its brief, bright work. Daniel let Lily drift towards sleep while he stood again, the floor answering his weight with small, tired notes. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. That was how you found the important things, by letting your attention move like water, touching edges without forcing a shape. He carried the flashlight the way one carries a blessing one isn't sure one deserves. Its beams slid along the baseboards, across a faded rug whose pattern had worn down to the memory of leaves. At the far wall, a door stuck a little before giving. The hinge spoke in a tone that sounded like relief. A short hall revealed itself, narrow, with a runner that had buckled in the middle. Pictures on the walls gone pale under glass. The faces inside the frames were strangers made of his bones, a brow like his father's, a jaw like a cousin's he hadn't seen since the service. He didn't study them. He didn't look away either. He let them be like weather on the edge of a long field. At the end of the hall, a room with a window that refused to open and a desk set under it, as if someone had needed the idea of a view even when the air would not come. The desk was heavy maple, its top scarred with the soft, honest wounds of ink and heat, the crescent where a cup had sat too often in the same place. Papers lay in squat, careful stacks, the kind of order that forgives dust. Daniel laid his palm flat on the wood before he pulled the chair back. The gesture felt like knocking. He sat. The chair answered with a sigh and then settled around the shape of him. A pocket knife with the paint rubbed off its handle. The knife turned into his palm like a thing that remembered being useful. He reached for the last drawer on the right. It wouldn't come. He tried the left bottom and found a ledger, columns in a hand that did not hurry, numbers marching the way men do when someone who loves them is watching. Tucked behind it, a thin book with a leather cover rubbed soft at the corners. He brought it into the circle of light and set it on the desk as if setting down a small animal that might run if startled. For a moment, he only looked at it. The leather held a faint salt smell, like old hands after work. He slid his thumb under the strap and eased it free. The first page was blank, but for a smudge in the upper corner where a finger had lingered before the ink dried. The next page offered a single line in a hand he did not have to be told was Samuel's. It didn't shout. It did not even insist. It said, almost conversationally, "You see a thing best when you are already on your way past it." He read it twice, not to memorize, only to let it find its place. He turned more pages. Not a diary in the usual sense. No dates saying what the weather did. No complaints about neighbors. Nothing of meals or ailments. Instead, the ink thickening as if the pen had paused on the paper and never returned. In the middle of the book, a thin map had been glued with care. Hand-drawn, no legend, no compass. Library, west, hold its breath at dusk. In the library corner, a small red mark no bigger than a seed. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't ask to be believed. It simply waited. Daniel let the flashlight rest on its base, the beam angling up, leaving the desk in a shallow bowl of light. He traced the map lightly with a finger, not to follow but to greet. He was careful not to press the red mark. He had known men who looked for answers as if answers were traps. He had been one once. Now he wanted something else, permission, maybe, to keep moving deeper into a life that hadn't invited him and hadn't turned him away. On the last pages, Samuel's hand grew larger, less careful. The lines took on the tilt of an older body that had begun to negotiate with gravity. Keep only what keeps you. A lock that never opens is just another weight. Family is not blood or law, but the ones who wait at the window when you are late. Then, a short paragraph, compressed and dark, where the nib must have dug deeper. Inside, resting alone as if it had been set there in a moment of second thought, lay a square of tracing paper folded into itself. He unfolded it carefully. It held a graphite rubbing, letters pressed from a plaque he didn't recognize, words reversed and pale. Not all doors are for getting out. Some are for letting in what you've carried too long. He did not understand it fully. He didn't press it to yield. He folded it back along the old creases and slipped it into the notebook, then slid the strap around the leather and pulled it snug. When he lifted the book, it felt heavier, not with secret gold or schematics, but with the old weight of someone else's unfinished sentences, the kind of weight a person learns to carry at the hip, his hand resting on the child's shoulder in a way that suggested both pride and apology. In another, the house itself in winter, roof hooded in snow, the porch rail in a row of soft white knuckles. He felt the ache families share without naming. The rooms we returned to long after the chairs had been changed. Lily had rolled on her back, one hand flung toward the thin square of cleared floor, the other tucked under her cheek. Her breathing held steady, the candle making a small halo out of the tiny hairs at her temple. He set the notebook on the mantel beside the stop clock. He eased himself down the wall to sit and stretched his legs into the geometry they had drawn with the broom. The night had gone quiet in that tender way after the last car on a distant road has passed, and even the insects paused between songs. He closed his eyes and let the sentences he'd read unscroll, not to study them, but to let them learn the shapes of his own breath. You see a thing best when you're already on your way past it. He held the line and did not argue with it. When he opened his eyes, the candle had leaned farther toward its dish, a soft tear of wax sliding down to join the small lake. He pinched the wick out between damp fingers. Darkness rose and settled. In the black, the memory of the room arranged itself in his mind. Doorway, chair, Lily, mantel, clock, book, like constellations a child could draw from the passenger seat. He lay back on the floor, the boards cool through the thin blanket, and let his body name every place it touched. The past lay down too, not as an enemy, not as a friend, More like an old coat thrown over a chair you aren't ready to fold, but you no longer mind seeing. He breathed with the house until the house, at last, breathed with him. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind that doesn't break a room open so much as lift it a little, enough for sight to find corners again. Lily had drifted sideways in the night, one hand open near the circle he'd swept with a broom, the other guarding the small country of her pillow. He watched her breathe a few cycles, then sat up slow, so the day would not startle. He made a circuit of the kitchen first, ran the tap until the metal taste thinned, found a clean enough mug with a hairline fracture, heated water in a dented kettle that remembered the shape of every stove it had met. Instant coffee dissolved into something close to comfort. He stood at the window while it cooled and traced the yard with his eyes, the gravel gone to grass, the fence leaning, the lilac bush near the porch showing a few stubborn leaves. The world was still here. That was something. By the time Lily stirred, the light had settled into the parlor at a workable angle. She sat up, hair half tangled out of its braid, the sleep still soft in her face. He handed her a cup of water and a slice of bread with peanut butter spread to the edges, soldier neat. She ate in small, deliberate bites, cheeks dimpling as she worked at the crust. Neither of them hurried. Beginning again asked for a certain slowness. They set about the morning in simple tasks. Daniel rolled the blanket, folded it twice, and set it on the chair back, as if to air. He shook the broom free of yesterday's dust and drew a fresh box on the floor. 4 strokes, corners squared, a practice not unlike prayer. Lily took up the dustpan without being asked. Work made sense to her. It still did to him. When the obvious was done, attention went hunting for what it hadn't noticed. Lily drifted toward the far end of the parlor, where the light from the west window fell low and long across the rug. The rug had once been red, now a thoughtful brown, with a border of vines that looped back on themselves. She crouched and laid her palm flat, feeling the nap shift under the heel of her hand. Near the bookcase, the pattern seemed to pool. She pressed there and felt the give, slight, but not in the way of fabric. Dad, she said not loud. More a note placed on a table. Not a warp. Something set into something. He ran his fingers along the seam until he found the narrowest crack, the place a blade would want. An iron ring lay flat, brown with age, but whole. Lily's breath shortened in that quick way wonder sometimes steals air. She didn't reach for it. She folded her hands in her lap, as if the ring were a bird that might spook. Daniel slid the panel farther until it rested against the bookcase. He tested the ring with 2 fingers. Cold. He wrapped them around it and lifted. The square door came up with a heavier sound than the floor had made, a throatier groan, as if a story were being told again after too many quiet years. The space below was not depthless. His eyes found steps immediately, the first 3, then the suggestion of more, descending at a measured pitch. The air that rose was earth and iron, steadying the edges the way you might steady a friend before the truth. Above them, the house said a few small things, pipes blinking awake, a beam adjusting to temperature. In the silence that followed, there was no menace, only the exact shape of the unknown. He felt the part of himself that had once walked first into doorways leaned toward it. Another part, the one that had learned to wait for a child's nod, held him at the lip. He stood and looked around the room as if to memorize it with the hatch closed. This was the room that had made a place for them when they'd needed one. He felt a brief, clean gratitude and let it pass without grabbing. He checked his watch out of habit. It told him nothing useful except where his wrist had been. He looked at Lily and saw what he needed. Not fear, not hunger for adventure, just readiness. She lifted her chin the smallest degree. A soldier's yes without saluting. He nodded back. Not now, his eyes said. Soon his hands agreed. He returned the floor panel to its seat, but did not press it flush. He left the seam visible. He fetched 2 nails from the drawer in the kitchen and set them on the mantel, not to secure anything, just to have the thought nearby. The day still had other things to ask, water to run clear, a fuse to find, a bed to make more like a bed. They ate lunch on the steps, backs warm where the sun reached them. A sandwich cut into neat halves. An apple shared, the core tossed to the weedy strip where it might return as something else years from now. Lily brushed crumbs from her lap with the side of her hand. careful not to send them into the crack where the boards didn't quite meet. Daniel followed the flight of a hawk as it rode its wide, patient circle above the cottonwoods. When he looked back at the yard, he could see the new geometry inside the house the way you could see a creek through trees, if you know it's there. He spent the next hour in small improvements. A screw tightened at the hinge, a window eased another inch to let the cross breeze learn the room, a line of ants negotiated with, gently deflected. Lily organized her pencils in a row by length, then ruined the order and made a new one by color. They spoke as little as necessary. Quiet preserved what had been found. Toward late afternoon, when the light turned the color of old brass, Daniel returned to the parlor and stood over the rug, as if the morning had left him a question, and here he was with his answer. He folded the corner back and pinched the edge of the panel once more, just to feel the weight of it. The ring lay where it had lain, unoffended by delay. He let the panel fall shut again, this time with a smaller sound, the kind you make when you intend to come back. He closed his eyes and listened, not for voices but for alignment. The house's breath, the child's breath, his own. They met in the middle and held for 3 heartbeats. He opened his eyes. The day had not changed. The room had not rearranged its furniture to applaud him. That was fine. Discovery didn't owe you a fanfare. It owed you a choice. Evening would ask for light, and then for sleep. Tomorrow would ask for the going down. He ran a hand along the back of the nearest chair. The fabric smooth under his palm where hands had taught it to be. He left the rug half-turned, a promise neither rushed nor broken. In a life that had been too full of sudden orders, this delay felt like a discipline. He could live with that. He turned toward the kitchen to set a pot to boil, and behind him, under the patient vines on the wallpaper, the house kept the place for them, the way a good friend holds your seat when you step out for air. Morning gave itself away in thin stripes along the floor, and then afternoon carried those stripes across the room until they touched the rug's frayed border. Daniel waited for the hour to tip toward evening. The hour when light turns forgiving and a man can stand at the mouth of the thing and not feel hurried by it. He cleared the low table, set the pitcher on the mantel, folded the blanket once more, not because any of it mattered to a hatch in the floor, but because order had always been the way he told himself he was ready. Lily watched him without asking. She had a way of holding her questions like small birds cupped in her hands, alive but quiet. When he lifted the corner of the rug again, she rose and came to stand at his side. The wood panel lifted easier this time, the groove remembering how to let go. The iron ring met his fingers like an old acquaintance. He raised the square door and leaned it against the bookcase. Cool air climbed the steps and touched their faces, carrying the smell of iron, stone, and something green that had never seen the sun. He fetched the flashlight and the battery lantern he'd found in a pantry, tested both, shook the lantern once to wake whatever chemistry still worked inside. He slipped a coil of twine into his back pocket and looped another around his wrist, the kind of small insurance a man brings to any descent. He did not tell Lily to be brave. He adjusted her braid, tucked the loose curl behind her ear, and rested his palm between her shoulders until her breath and his agreed. The first step received his weight without complaint. It was wider than it looked, the edges worn to a softness that spoke of use long ago. He placed the lantern down one step, then another, so light would rise toward them instead of falling away. Dust glittered in the beam like the slowest weather on earth. Lily came behind him, one hand on his belt loop, the other sliding along the wall. Fingertips reading the shallow gouges left by whoever had carried weight down here before. The staircase turned after the 5th tread. The angle let the upstairs room vanish from view, taking with it the comforting geometry of door-chair mantel book. In its place came a quiet with shape, not the absence of sound, but the presence of old work, drops of water, counting time somewhere. The faint tick of cooling metal would easing its shoulders as the day cooled. Daniel breathed through his nose and tasted stone, the way you can taste the inside of a church if you stand in the nave long enough. At the bottom, the lantern declared a room. It was larger than he'd imagined, its ceiling low enough that he could lay his palm flat against the joists if he reached. White sheets covered what lay on the tables, their hems stirring slightly in the draft, the way a sleeping thing lifts and settles in its sleep. Shelves ran along 2 walls, built from thick planks. On them, boxes in careful ranks, jars with wax-sealed lids, coffee cans labeled in a blocky hand. The labels were not grand. Nails, assorted. Hinges, old gate. Keys, don't toss. The everyday made beautiful by attention. He swept the flashlight slowly, not to catch everything, but to let the room introduce itself. A workbench stood under a small, high window bricked in from the outside, the kind of house uses to remember day. On the bench, a vise, a hand plane with its blade oiled and wrapped, a lidded tin that, when opened, offered the ghost of turpentine. On a pegboard, tools hung in outlines made by dust. The hammer still there, the saw gone, the empty silhouettes like questions that had already been answered. Lily's hand left his belt loop and wandered to a row of jars. Her finger traced letters along one cloudy glass. Buttons, mother of pearl. She did not lift the lid. She only looked at how the light made little moons of each disc, and let that be enough. For every story that runs on a shout, there's another that runs on the way a child reads a label and understands a history she never lived. They moved together, Daniel clearing a path with his hip and shoulder, Lily stepping where his boot had tested. The sheets whispered as they passed. He lifted one and found a small treadle sewing machine, belt cracked but intact. A spool of thread still clinging to its post like a stubborn idea. Under another, a trunk with leather corners, not locked, its lid heavy with disuse. He left it closed, not from fear, from the discipline he'd promised himself. No leaps, no running ahead of his breath. Against the far wall stood a cabinet, shallow and tall, with a glass door crazed into a spider's web of hairline cracks. Inside, pinned to cork, were not butterflies but papers, yellowed receipts, a county map, a hand-drawn diagram of the house's foundation with arrows that looked like songs. In the lower right corner, Samuel's hand again. Blue room, west, holds its breath at dusk. A red the size of a freckle winked from a place that now matched the room above where a rug lay half-turned. Daniel felt the steadying that comes when a thing you've suspected decides to agree with you. He set the lantern on a stool and allowed his shoulders to settle that inch they owed him. Lily stepped into the lantern's circle and turned her palms to the warmth. Her face held that look that is not quite a smile and not quite a question, an in-between expression that belongs to thresholds. He found a fuse panel tucked behind a swinging board and opened it to see porcelain fuses lined like teeth in an old jaw. He touched each with a knuckle, the way a man greets a horse he used to ride. Someday, he thought. Not today. He closed the panel and slid the board back until its nail bruise disappeared into the wall. In the corner nearest the stairs, someone had chalked a mark at knee height, a simple X, not the dramatic kind, only 2 lines that had met on purpose. Beside it, penciled smaller, listen here. He crouched, laid 2 fingers against the stone, and waited. At first he heard his own pulse being loud, the human habit of thinking itself the important noise. Then behind it a thinner sound. Water moving slowly through pipe or crack, the house swallowing and clearing its throat. He had learned in other lives to trust faint sounds. They seldom lied. He stood and let his hand sweep the ceiling. Cobwebs took the gesture as compliment and swung slightly. In a high corner, a swallow's nest had been abandoned mid-build. Grasses tucked and then forgotten, the blueprint of a home never finished. He understood that, too. He turned in place, taking the room a quadrant at a time. Shelves, bench, cabinet, trunk. No menace stood up to greet him. No promise either. Only provision, put by for a season that might not come. He had come anyway. That counted for something. Lily's attention had settled on a small wooden crate pushed almost under the stairs. She pointed, and he pulled it out with his boot. Inside, 3 hardcover books wrapped in oilcloth. Their corners softened, their spines unlettered. He unwrapped one and found Samuel's script again between printed lines. Margins crowded with weather, dates, the price of flour. The name of a neighbor's dog. A page near the back bore a softer hand. Not Samuel's, but someone who cared for him. Eat more. Sleep. He closed the cover and slid the book back into its weatherproof skin. They sat on the bottom step for a while, the lantern warm between their knees. An old basement has a clock all its own. Minutes feel wider there, the way light does in certain churches. Daniel rested his elbows on his thighs and let his hands hang. Lily leaned her shoulder against his arm and breathed like someone learning a new lullaby. Down here, the past was not a weight so much as a temperature, cool, present, altering the way the air moved through you. He could live with that. When they climbed, he let Lily go first so he could keep a hand at her calf, not touching unless she wobbled. She didn't. outwardly obedient. He felt the house take a long, slow breath that matched his own. Not relief, exactly. Recognition. They did not speak. He poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to Lily. She drank and then pressed the cool rim to her cheek. Daniel stood by the window and watched evening lay its gentle weight on the yard. He thought of the words in the notebook. Keep only what keeps you. He thought of the chalk by the stair. Listen here. He thought of how dissent hadn't changed the world and had quietly changed the size of his heart inside his chest. Night would come, as it always did, and tomorrow they would go down again, not to hunt, but to continue a conversation the house had begun long before they arrived. For now, the day closed itself around the small fact of their return, and it was enough. Afternoon thinned to a pale gold that made even the broken things look forgiven. Daniel had the front door propped with a brick, letting the house trade its stale breath for air that had known trees. He'd spent an hour sanding a soft blister from the porch rail, the paper whispering in patient circles. Lily sat cross-legged on the step with her pencils lined like small soldiers. Expensive purr that didn't fit this road. The dust rose in its wake, a pale veil. Then a black SUV ghosted into view and stopped with a careful flourish, as if parking were performance. The engine cut. Silence fell for a single beat, the kind that comes when a bird of prey crosses a field and all the smaller things go quiet. Marian stepped out first. Beige dress the color of bakery paper. Sunglasses that reflected the house back as a warped postcard. Behind her, Franklin Dawson unfolded from the passenger seat in a gray suit that carried air conditioning with it. A man from the center of rooms, standing now at the edge of Daniel's. Lily's pencil stopped moving. She didn't stand. She closed the sketchbook and set it in her lap, palms resting on the cover as if keeping a lid on water. Daniel laid the sandpaper down on the rail and wiped his hands on a rag that wouldn't come clean. He didn't go down the steps. He didn't invite them up. He let the space between do the talking. Afternoon, Marianne said finally, but the word came wrapped in tissue, too smooth to hold. She looked past Daniel, past Lily. The practice scan of someone assessing a room she plans to rearrange. Her gaze snagged for half a second on the corner of the parlor rug inside. The faint swell where wood had decided to remember its hinge. Then the look slid on, casual the way a cat's paw is casual before it closes. Franklin adjusted his cuff and smiled with only his teeth. He held a manila folder down at his side, where sunshine couldn't reach it. The folder had that prim, fat look of papers that intend to change something living into something filed. Daniel reached for the coffee mug on the railing, found it empty, and put it back the way it had been. The porch boards answered his weight in the old dialect of houses left alone too long. He could smell the SUV even with its engine quiet. New leather, Freon, money. No one mentioned the party. No one asked about the drive. Marianne lifted her sunglasses with 2 fingers and set them on her head. Her eyes were tired in the way mirrors are tired, reflecting other people's light all day. She let her mouth tilt toward Kind and stopped just before it got there. We were in the neighborhood, she said, which was the kind of sentence that makes truth roll its eyes. She let her gaze slip again toward the doorway, a fish testing a line. Lily's shoe tapped once against the step, an arrhythmic metronome. Daniel put his hand on the rail, palm flat, as if to steady the house. Porch is soft on the far end, he said to no one, to the wood, to the air between them. Watch your step. Franklin's smile deepened a notch, as if he appreciated the courtesy. He climbed 2 steps and stopped at the landing, positioning himself so his shoulder blocked a sliver of the threshold. Marianne remained in the sun, turning her wrist so her watch could catch it. The gesture made the time appear important. Is she eating? Marianne asked, eyes on Lily's hairline where the braid had begun to loosen, sleeping, going to school. The list was gentle, almost motherly, and carried the soft weight of a ledger. She didn't wait for answers. She let the questions be an atmosphere. Daniel nodded once. He didn't inventory his care. He didn't hold it up like a receipt. Lily looked at the place where her pencil had paused and drew a single line there. A quiet act of defiance that no one but him would see. From inside the house a pipe clicked, then settled. Franklin angled his chin toward the doorway, sniffed in a way that suggested concern without committing to it. These old places, he said, half airy, sometimes a smell rises from the ground. Damp, mold, basements can be surprising. He said surprising the way a man says lawsuit. Daniel let the words sit on the step beside them and go nowhere. He didn't look at the rug. He didn't follow their noses into the rooms. He drank from an empty mug and set it down again, the ritual calming because it changed nothing. Mary Ann's left heel sank the smallest bit between boards, leaving an oval mark that would outlast the afternoon. She glanced down, then up, a quick line drawn between evidence and aim. "I worry," she said, the vowels polished, "about safety, about what's under things." She looked at Lily when she said it. The look was almost tender if you tilted it. Lily reached up and tucked the loose curl behind her ear herself, a task Daniel's hands had taken earlier. She moved slow, careful, like someone oiling a hinge. When she finished, she folded her hands again and waited with a patience that wasn't submission. Franklin opened the manila folder but didn't remove anything. The flap whispered. Inside, the papers shifted like birds in a box. He seemed to enjoy the sound. "You understand?" He said to the porch rail more than to Daniel. "There are standards. Agencies. People who ensure adequacy." He let the last word dangle, a hook without bait, because metal alone can wound. Daniel breathed through his nose, counted 4, and let it out. He had learned in other deserts to conserve water and sentences. When making it livable, he said, "One board at a time." Sometimes the shortest spans are the most revealing. He smiled like a man leaving a tip. Mary Ann slipped her sunglasses back down, a curtain lowered. "We'll be in touch," she said, and turned, the hem of her dress lifting the faintest dust as if the air were telling secrets. Franklin stepped back the way he had come, careful not to brush the doorframe, as if old wood could stain a suit. They took the steps, the gravel, the car. The engine woke in a purr. The SUV performed the slow, exact reverse of arrival, and then was gone, its sound stitching itself shut behind them. Dust rose and settled. The lilac kept its quiet counsel. For a while, no one moved. Daniel picked up his sandpaper, but didn't resume the circle. He rubbed his thumb along the grid, feeling where it had dulled. Lily opened her sketchbook and erased the line she'd drawn in defiance, not because it was wrong, but because the page could be better used. She drew the rectangle of the rug, instead, a simple shape, then shaded the edge where a shadow might collect. She left the center blank. He watched her work and felt the slow, familiar tilt of his insides toward the thing he could not change. People who came not to see, but to measure. The old urge to run flared and faded. He set it down beside the empty mug, 2 objects that could pass for useful if the light hit right. Acceptance was not a cape you put on once. It was a habit of hands. He placed his palm to the rail again, the sanded patch smooth as a thought finally finished. Soft on the far end, he said to the wood, to the day, to the ones who might come again with folders and questions. He would brace it. He would brace himself. In the doorway behind him, the house held the cool left from the basement and waited, not as a secret, but as a room you step into when you're tired of being asked to prove you live here. Daniel didn't follow the dust trail the SUV left. He stayed where the day had put him, one hand on the rail, the other resting open at his side, until the quiet closed again over the yard. It closed differently now, the way a pond settles after a thrown stone, new rings moving out to the edges, finding their own slow end. He picked up the sandpaper and set it down. What he had to say wouldn't ride his sentence well. It would have to live in what he fixed. He brought the hammer from inside and a small tin of screws he'd found under the sink. The front hinge had sagged enough to make the door complain each time it met the jamb. He knelt, braced the wood with his shoulder, and eased the screws out one by one, wiping each on his jeans, as if they were coins that might still buy something. He set a shim where the frame had slipped and drove the first new screw home. Not hard, just certain. The wood answered with a low, accepting sound. Behind him, Lily turned a page and began again, drawing the porch the way she wanted it to feel. Lines straightened, the soft end made firm. That was his answer, or the beginning of it. A steady hinge. A truer line. You could tell a cord 100 things. A door that closes cleanly says them better. He worked a rail next, sanding until the raised grain lay down, then brushing the dust into his palm and letting the wind take it. The sky had gone that deeper blue evening keeps for itself. Swallows looped their purposeful, careless loops over the cottonwoods. He pulled a rag through the slot where the screen had begun to bow, set a tack, and pressed the wire back to true. Each small repair made the house lift a little, as if bones were remembering how to carry weight. Inside, the kitchen faucet coughed, and then gave him water without sediment. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove with the right kind of care, the kind that expects things to work because you will keep after them until they do. Steam threaded the air, leaving its soft ghost on the window. He poured into 2 mismatched mugs and set one beside Lily without breaking her drawings line. She reached for it in the space between strokes, her eyes still on the page. On the table sat the leather notebook with Samuel's half-prayers and half-plans. Daniel untied the strap and opened to the page where the words had been written in a darker hand. Keep only what keeps you. He didn't need to copy it, didn't need to underline. He closed the book and put it on the mantel again, spine outward, as if to let the room read it, too. Dusk found them sweeping. He drew the broom's soft bristle along the baseboards and corners, collecting what the day had shrugged loose. Lily followed with the pan, tipping the pale crescent of dust into the bag like a ritual. They didn't speak. Their agreement didn't require it. Nothing given away that the house needed. Nothing taken that didn't belong to them. When the porch boards had cooled, he fetched a small tin of oil and a rag, knelt at the hinge he'd reset, and offered the pin a thin line. He swung the door once, twice. It didn't sing, didn't moan, didn't announce itself. It moved the way a good promise moves, quietly, to where it said it would go. He smiled without showing it and wiped the excess from the hinge so it wouldn't gather dust. Only then did he write something down. At the parlor table, on the back of a grocery receipt, he printed in a careful block the words he could live inside. We stay. We mend. We wait for no one's permission to belong. He slid the scrap under the candle dish, a private oath pinned with wax. Night pressed its ear to the windows. He set the latch without locking it, not out of carelessness, but because trust was a muscle he intended to exercise. He folded the blanket, squared the corners, and drew a new box on the floor with the broom. 4 strokes, corners neat. Lily put her pencils away in a tin that used to hold tea. She placed it on the mantel next to the clock and the book, like a third witness. Before sleep, he stepped onto the porch again to send the day off. The gravel was a dull ribbon. The lilac gave one last fragrance as the air cooled. Out beyond the fence line, a late truck groaned and then was gone. He could still feel the shape of the manila folder in the air where Franklin had held it, the careful thread of paper. He let the feeling pass through him like weather. Some storms you outwait by standing under the eave and listening to the downspouts learn their job. He spoke then, but not outward. He told his body to remember this. The door that no longer snatched at the jamb. The rail that took a palm and offered steadiness back. The quiet that wasn't empty but earned. He told himself what he had been telling himself since the gate first opened under his shoulder. Acceptance isn't surrender. It is a posture that frees the hands for work. When he lay down, the boards received him without complaint. Lily settled in the square they'd swept, her breath making its small, regular tense. He watched the ceiling find its darker version of itself, and in that slow shift, felt the day's answer finish writing itself in him. No speeches, no raised voice, just a house repaired one hinge at a time, a girl who kept drawing after visitors left, and a man who would not trade either for a cleaner story. That was his refusal. That was his yes. It started the way most things in a small town do. Half a truth, carried on a voice that didn't know how to hold it. Someone's cousin had driven past the Carter place and seen the truck out front, the porch light on for the first time in years. Someone else claimed they'd heard Franklin Dawson himself had been there, papers in hand. By the time the words reached the diner, the story had grown teeth. Daniel had found something valuable in the old house, something worth fighting over. At the feed store, 2 men leaned against the counter, talking low over a jar of nails. You hear about that soldier boy and his windfall? One asked. The other shrugged, but his eyes narrowed the way people's do when they want to believe a thing. Daniel noticed it in smaller ways. A neighbor who used to nod, now stared a second too long. The cashier of the hardware store asked about the house, her tone wrapped in the softness people use when they're really asking about something else. Even Lily caught it, the way kids at school whispered before she sat down, then stopped when she did. He didn't chase the talk down. That was a kind of war he had no interest in fighting. Instead, he kept to the work, fixing the loose board on the steps, scraping the last of the peeling paint from the window trim. But in the quiet between hammer blows, he could feel it, rumor settling over the place like a fine layer of dust. Not heavy yet, but enough to change the light. And in that change, he understood something. Whatever they thought he'd found, the real treasure was already here, walking barefoot through the hallway, leaving pencil shavings on the kitchen table. That was the part no one could take by talking. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between the grocery flyer and the electric bill. Heavy paper. His name printed in a typeface too clean to belong to anything friendly. Daniel turned it over once before opening it, the way you might handle a photograph you're not sure you want to see. Inside, a summons. Marianne Carter versus Daniel Carter. Petition for custody modification. Petition for partition of inherited property. The words were stacked like bricks, building something meant to stand against him. He read it at the kitchen table, the morning light catching the rim of his coffee cup. Lily was in the other room, humming without knowing it, a pencil tapping against her notebook. He let the hum steady him before reading it again, slower. Marianne claimed the house was unsafe for a child. She claimed he lacked the means to provide stability. And, in a line that seemed almost careless in its cruelty, she suggested the property would be better utilized if sold. Daniel set the papers down beside the small tin of screws he'd been using to fix the porch rail. The two things looked wrong together, one built to hold things steady, the other meant to undo. He didn't crumple the notice. He didn't curse. Instead, he folded it along the crease and slid it back into the envelope. The law would have it say. So would he. Outside, the hinge he'd oiled swung without complaint when he stepped onto the porch. Somewhere beyond the fence line, a dog barked twice, sharp and certain. He took that sound with him, as if it were a promise. The hearing room smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee gone cold. Fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a flat glow over the long table where the custody board sat. 3 faces lined with years of listening to other people's trouble. Daniel took the seat they pointed to, his boots leaving a trace of road dust on the linoleum. Marianne was already there, in a slate-gray dress that matched the steel in her posture. Beside her, Franklin Dawson leaned back in his chair, the way men do when they're certain the room tilts their way. Their lawyer, sharp suit and sharper tongue, shuffled papers like a magician about to pull a trick. They asked Daniel questions about the house, about Lily's schooling, about his income. He answered plainly, the way he'd learned to in the service. Stick to the facts, don't decorate them. But he could feel the weight of their eyes, measuring more than his words, measuring whether he belonged in the life he was asking to keep. When they brought up the condition of the property, Franklin's mouth twitched into something close to a smile. Daniel didn't rise to it. He spoke about the repairs already made, the rooms cleared of dust, the space Lily had claimed as her own. By the time it was over, no verdict was given, just a nod from the chairwoman, and a promise they'd review the matter. Daniel left the room the same way he'd entered, but the air felt different on his skin. It was the air you breathe when you know the fight has only just begun. The order came in the mail, same as the summons had. No knock at the door. No phone call, just a thin envelope with too much finality inside. Temporary change of custody, effective immediately. Lily to reside with her mother until the court's final decision. Daniel read it once, then again, as if the words might shift if he stared hard enough. They didn't. Outside, late afternoon light slanted across the porch, catching on the tools he'd left by the rail. He should have put them away earlier, but now they looked like relics from another kind of day. He told Lily that evening, not in a rush, not with panic in his voice. She sat on the edge of her bed, knees pulled up, listening without interrupting. Her small hands tightened around the stuffed bear she'd had since before he came home. She didn't cry, not then. She only nodded, as if agreeing to something neither of them wanted. The next morning, Marianne arrived in a car that smelled faintly of perfume and leather. Lily hugged him once, quick but fierce, her cheek pressing into the rough fabric of his shirt. Then she was gone, the car door closing with a sound that seemed to empty the yard. When the dust settled, Daniel stood in the doorway, the house too quiet. In the kitchen, her glass of milk still sat on the table, a thin skin forming on top. He didn't pour it out. He left it there until evening, the silence filling the space she'd left behind. At first, Daniel didn't know where to start. The truth wasn't something you could just reach for on a shelf. It hid in folds, in corners people forgot to look at. He cleared the dining table, spreading out a notepad, the court papers, and a battered shoebox of receipts he'd kept more from habit than intention. Nights were the best time to work. The house had a different kind of quiet then, not the hollow kind that reminded him Lily was gone, but a steady stillness that let his mind move. He went through every drawer, every folder. Utility bills showing he kept the lights on, grocery receipts with Lily's favorite cereal circled in pen, doctor's notes from her checkups. Proof that the life they had together wasn't the unstable picture Marianne's lawyer was painting. In a box in the attic, beneath an old army blanket, he found something heavier, a packet of bank statements with Franklin Dawson's name on them. They weren't meant for him, different address. Different world, but the numbers told a story. Withdrawals that didn't match the income Franklin bragged about. Payments to accounts Daniel didn't recognize. He began to stack the papers in two piles, what spoke of him as a father, and what might speak against them. Each sheet felt like a brick in a wall he could build between Lily and the life they were trying to pull her into. Sometimes he'd pause, staring at a photograph on the wall. Lily in the yard last spring, hair tangled from the wind, grinning at Murphy as if the world had no sharp edges. That was the picture he wanted the court to see, not the one drawn up in legal filings. By the time the clock struck 2, he had a neat stack of evidence on the table. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start, and starts, he knew, were how you won long fights. It was the smell of cedar that drew him to the old desk in Samuel Carter's study. Daniel hadn't opened those drawers since the day he inherited the house, partly out of respect, partly because some things felt too heavy to disturb. But that night, with Lily gone and the walls pressing closer, he slid the chair back and began to look. The top drawer held the usual, pens gone dry, envelopes yellowing at the edges, a brass letter opener shaped like a bayonet. The second drawer stuck halfway, resisting before giving way with a groan. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, the kind that carried its own weight in the hand. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with Samuel's handwriting, dense, looping cursive that leaned forward like it had somewhere to be. Most entries were dated in the years after Samuel had retired from the service. They weren't about battles or medals. They were about the town, the family, the land. And more than once, about Franklin Dawson. Daniel read lines that caught in his chest. Franklin has been circling the property again. He thinks I don't notice, but men like him can't help themselves. Another entry. Later. If anything happens to me, Daniel must know the truth. It's in the box under the floorboards. His pulse slowed and sharpened at the same time. He flipped further, finding notes on property deeds, cryptic references to bank transfers, even a sketched map of the house with one room shaded in. In the margin, Samuel had written, "Only for the right hands." Daniel set the notebook beside the growing stack of evidence on the dining table. The words weren't just memories. They were a trail, one that Samuel had trusted him to follow. It struck him then that this was more than a legal fight. It was about finishing something Samuel had started, about defending a trust passed down not through courts or signatures, but through the quiet faith of family. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing the porch in a way that sounded almost like footsteps. Daniel closed the notebook, his fingers resting on the worn leather. For the first time in weeks, he felt less like a man cornered, and more like one holding the next move. The morning light came thin and pale through the kitchen window, dust motes drifting in its path like small, hesitant truths. Daniel sat at the table with a shoebox he hadn't opened in years. It was Lily's, filled with photographs, some bent at the corners, some still smelling faintly of the developer's chemicals. He spread them out, one by one, across the table. There was Lily in the backyard, barefoot in the frost, her breath fogging the air as she held up the first snowball of winter. Another showed her perched on the hood of the old Chevy, her hair tangled from the wind, grinning at Murphy's wagging tail. There were birthday cakes, muddy boots left by the door, and a close-up of her hand clutching the worn strap of her school bag. Daniel didn't choose these at random. Each photograph told a small truth the court needed to see. Not stage moments, but the everyday pulse of their life together. He sorted them into an order. Mornings in the kitchen over oatmeal. Afternoons in the garden. Evenings reading on the porch. A visual map of a home, stitched together by time and care. From the desk, he pulled out the leather-bound notebook Samuel had left him. He laid certain pages beside the photos. Samuel's words about family, about protecting what mattered. Together, the images and the handwriting formed something fuller than testimony. It was proof that life here had weight, texture, belonging. As he worked, Daniel felt the edge of his frustration soften. This wasn't about outmaneuvering Franklin or Marianne anymore. It was about showing the truth so plainly that even strangers in a courtroom could feel it. A life couldn't be argued when it was right there, breathing in front of you, even if it was on paper and in ink. By the time the kitchen light shifted to afternoon, the table was covered in a quiet story only he and Lily had lived. All that was left was to carry it into the fight. It started with a single post, a photograph Daniel had taken months before of Lily sitting on the porch steps with Murphy's head in her lap. He hadn't meant for it to be anything more than a memory, but when he paired it with a few lines about the custody fight and the history of the house, it took on a different weight. By evening, neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years were leaving comments. Some remembered Samuel Carter as a man who fixed fences without being asked, who left jars of honey on doorsteps in winter. Others spoke of seeing Daniel walking Lily to school every morning, even in the rain. They didn't write like they were taking sides in a legal battle. They wrote like they were recalling the shape of a man's life. A retired teacher posted about how Lily had stayed late after class to help clean up art supplies, saying she'd learned it from her dad. A farmer down the road shared a story about Daniel lending him tools and refusing payment. One by one, these small, ordinary memories began to stack up, forming something louder than Daniel could have built alone. Local reporters picked it up next. Not the big city kind, but the weekly paper that still printed school sports scores and church bake sale announcements. They ran a piece under the headline, "Veteran Fights to Keep Family Home and Daughter." What struck Daniel most wasn't the attention. It was the way the community framed it. They didn't talk about a ruined house or a broken marriage. They talked about roots, about what it meant to stand in the same soil your father and his father had stood in. One night, as he read through the messages, Daniel realized something had shifted. This wasn't just his fight anymore. The town had taken a quiet stake in it. And that meant Marianne and Franklin weren't only up against him. They were up against a place that remembered. The call came just after sunset, when the house was steeped in that deep, blue quiet between day and night. Daniel almost didn't answer. Too many evenings lately had been filled with voices he didn't want to hear. But something in the way the phone kept ringing made him pick it up. Marianne's voice was measured, almost gentle, the way a person might speak when they're holding a hand of cards they believe will win. She didn't waste time on small talk. Instead, she laid it out plainly. She and Franklin were willing to drop the custody claim if Daniel agreed to sell them the house. He didn't answer right away. The words hung between them, the kind that sounded reasonable if you ignored everything underneath. Marianne spoke again, painting it as a fair trade. Lily would be spared the back and forth of courtrooms. Daniel would get a clean break, and Franklin would restore the house to its former glory. Daniel could picture Franklin standing behind her, maybe even feeding her the lines. He could also picture the way Franklin had hovered around Samuel's land years ago, circling like a crow waiting for something to die. He let her finish before saying anything. Outside, a lone truck passed on the road, its headlights sweeping briefly across the living room wall. Daniel thought of the photographs spread out on the kitchen table, of Samuel's looping handwriting in the leather-bound notebook, of the smell of cedar from the hidden desk. "No," he said finally, his voice steady but low. "The house isn't for sale, and Lily isn't a bargaining chip." There was a pause, just long enough to tell him she hadn't expected that answer. When she spoke again, her tone was cooler, the warmth gone. She said they'd see him in court, then hung up. Daniel sat for a while in the dim room, the phone still in his hand. The offer had been tempting in its simplicity, but simplicity had a way of hiding what it cost. And some things, he knew, couldn't be traded without losing more than you gained. The morning after Marianne's call, the air was brittle with frost. Daniel stood on the porch, coffee cooling in his hands, watching the breath of the horses rise from the neighboring field. And the court would listen, because that was its job. Daniel went inside, pulled open the kitchen drawer, and took out the thin folder that held his notes. Dates, receipts, copies of Samuel's will. The photographs were stacked in a neat pile beside them, the sequence still intact from the night before. He could feel the weight of what he had, and the weight of what he didn't. There wasn't going to be a halfway solution. Not anymore. The only way to keep Lily and the house was to take the fight to its end. No agreements behind closed doors. No compromises that would let Franklin in through the back gate. He thought about Lily, about the way she'd look at him when he picked her up from school. She never asked for details, but he could see the questions in her eyes. She was waiting to know if home was going to stay home. Daniel set the folder on the table, beside Samuel's leather-bound notebook. He opened to the page where Samuel had written in his careful hand, "Some things you keep, not because they're perfect, but because they're yours." That morning, Daniel made his choice. He would go all the way through the trial, no matter how long it took or how much of himself it asked for. Across from him, Marianne kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, Franklin leaning back in his chair like a man already certain of the outcome. The judge called for opening statements. But Daniel barely heard the formalities. His focus was on the small stack of items his attorney began to lay out. Photographs, letters, the notebook. One by one, the images were projected on the screen at the front. Samuel standing beside the barn, arm around a much younger Daniel. Lily helping him paint the porch, her hair tied back with a red ribbon. The photographs weren't just pictures. They were proof of a life, of bonds that had been tended even in the lean years. Then came the notebook, pages filled with Samuel's looping script, entries about repairs on the house, planting in the garden, and, most important, his wishes for the property to remain in Daniel's hands. The attorney read aloud a passage in which Samuel wrote of the house as the anchor in the river, holding against the current. Murmurs spread through the room. Franklin's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed it, noting the document's clear intent. Mary Ann's jaw tightened, her fingers curling slightly against the tabletop. Daniel didn't speak until the very end. When the judge asked if he had anything to add, he simply said, "This house was my father's and my father's father's. It's my daughter's now. I'm just here to make sure it's still standing when she's ready for it." The room was quiet for a moment after. Not the silence of formality, but the kind that comes when the truth leaves no room for argument. The verdict came on a Tuesday morning, carried in the measured voice of the judge. Custody of Lily was returned to Daniel, her fingers brushing along the wall as if reacquainting herself with an old friend. Daniel followed, noting how the light caught in the grain of the floorboards. A photograph of Samuel on the mantel, the quilt Mary Ann's mother had made, folded over the back of the couch. The coffee tin on the kitchen counter, dented but still serviceable. As the day wore on, a fire crackled in the hearth. Lily curled up in the armchair with a book, her hair falling over one shoulder. Daniel sat across from her, watching the flames lick at the logs, the warmth settling into the walls. It was still the same house, peeling paint, sagging beams, the faint draft under the kitchen door, but it no longer felt abandoned. It had been fought for, kept, lived in. It held laughter and anger, loss and stubborn love. Daniel understood, then, what Samuel had meant in his notebook. A house wasn't just wood and nails. Given enough years, enough memories, it could grow a soul. And this one at last was breathing again. The fire had burned low, its glow soft against the worn wood of the living room. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. Lily had fallen asleep in the armchair, her books slipping to the floor, her breathing steady in the quiet. Daniel rose slowly, tucking a blanket around her shoulders. He stood there a moment, watching her, the lines in his face easing. For the first time in years, there was no edge to the silence, only a kind of peace that didn't ask for anything more. He stepped to the window. The house stood solid against the night, as if it had been waiting all along for its people to come back. A place, he thought, could hold you the way arms do, if you let it. Maybe life would never be perfect. The roof would leak again. Not for noise, but because stories like this keep the walls warm long after the fire fades.